My grandfather took me to a cave in the middle of the night, and I think something followed us. I grew up in a small rural town in Mexico, so remote that time had rendered us as insignificant. Like everywhere out of the main cities, we struggled to remain afloat during the tough economic times. But the poverty my family endured was much worse than the rest of the families around us. My family consisted of me living with my grandparents all alone in a wooden shack up in the hills of Oaxaca, tending to some crops and animals. My parents had left me as an infant in search of a better life, but died somewhere along the way. That's what I was told, but I can't be too sure, because they never found any bodies, nor did I ever meet them. I'd like to think that maybe they found that life and were coming back to save us. I remember being so hungry that I would search the fields for hours looking for any fruits I could eat. I would even pick off the bugs that made their way into the yellow skins of the guavas and take a bite, before putting them in a basket, hoping they would last for days. I would brush my teeth with hand soap because we couldn't afford regular toothbrush. When I was 8 years old, I remember my grandmother falling sick. She complained about sudden chest pains and soreness on her arms. She would hunch over in agonizing pain, and eventually, with my grandfather's help, we were able to take her to the local clinic, where they told us that if we were there any second later, she would have been dead. She was diagnosed with a congestive heart failure, which meant that her heart was not functioning properly. Life expectancy can range from 5 to 10 years, depending on lifestyle changes, medication, and genetics. Getting a heart transplant was out of question because they said she was too old. I remember my grandfather in distress as we waited outside of the clinic, thinking about ways to get some money. "Ay, mijo, I don't know what we're going to do. We could barely afford to feed and clothe ourselves. And now, we have to pay for your grandmother's medications," my grandfather would cry out while praying silently. A couple days later, we were sent back home, taking my grandmother with us. She was hanging on by a thread, lying in bed sleeping, in complete contrast to her energetic, cheerful self. Late one night, my grandfather woke me up and ushered me to take a walk with him. I remember it being so late that even the animals were asleep. "Shh, it's just me. Don't wake your grandmother up. Come with me. I need to do something, and I can't do it alone." My grandfather shook me gently while lighting up an oil lamp. I grabbed my shoes on and started following him outside. We started walking to the side of the shack where the animals were all cooped up. I was so groggy that I was barely registering the fact that he was carrying a machete and a wooden cage. "What's that for?" I asked, curious as to what he was doing in the middle of the night. There were barely any animals in this area, and this was not the right season either. He stopped for a minute, facing my direction for a solid minute before speaking. "I need you to be silent on what we are going to do tonight. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, you cannot speak about this to anyone. Do you understand?" The light of the fire in the lamp casted a shadow on his face, and I could see the pupils of his eyes boring a hole into my soul. I didn't know what the hell was going to happen, but the fact that I never saw him this serious before unnerved me. "I understand," I nodded in utter silence. He grabbed a white chicken, which fought back what little it could, but it proved futile as it went into the cage. He then stuck the cage onto my hands and I trailed after him. We started taking off into the darkness of the night, having only the small light of our lamp as a guide, which seemed useless to me as it all looked the same, but somehow my grandfather seemed to know where to go. It must have been a 2-hour walk, but it felt like forever before we reached it. A pitch black entrance in the middle of the side of a rocky wall, surrounded by dead trees. It was as if there was a sudden line where everything just decided to die altogether. The hairs on my neck had started to stand straight up as if a warning that we were not meant to be here. I wanted to turn away and run, but my grandfather didn't seem to care. He merely continued on into the entrance, which was blacker than anything I've ever seen. We didn't stray too far into the cave, however, merely staying in the area between the entrance and the darkness. I motioned for me to set the cage down and leaned into the ear. "Once I do it, we will walk back home, and you will not look back, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" His voice had now quivered, yet remained a little above a whisper. I merely nodded, and he opened the cage and grabbed the poor bird, which started fighting even more than before. He motioned me to grab it, and I was so afraid of dropping it that I held on to it tighter than I should have. It tried pecking at my arms and struggling out. Its little chunky, frail body was trembling, and its legs kicked as it tried to free itself. But that struggle ended abruptly as my grandfather put the machete around its neck, and with a swift movement, I felt its body go limp. I tried to turn away when he did that, but when I felt the warm, thick liquid run down my hands, I felt completely disgusted. I witnessed my grandparents kill and clean out a chicken before, but this wasn't for culinary purposes. What the hell is this for? He grabbed the chicken's body with both hands and threw it as far as he could into the darkness of the cavern, before grabbing my arm and pulling me towards the entrance of the cavern. It was as if a gust of wind had come out of the cavern. A disgusting, warm, foul breeze had exited from the behind us, so strong that it almost blew my grandfather's sombrero from his head. The smell was so vile that I had trouble keeping a still face, and it took everything from me not to gag or throw up. That's when I heard it. It was the sound of a horse neighing from behind us in the distance. At first I thought it was my imagination, but it wasn't until I heard the click-clack of its hooves that I realized it was real. There was an actual horse in the cave coming out towards us, but there was something malignant about it. There was another noise coming from it, like the sounds of metallic chains being dragged across the floor of the cave. As frightening as it was, the noise was alluring. It was begging me to take one look at the source of the sound. I think my grandfather could tell because he put his hand on the back of my head, and we kept marching forward. I'm not sure how long we were in there, because by the time we reached through the line of the dead trees, we could see that it was dusk. The sounds of the chains and the clacking of the hooves had started to dissipate, but my fear was still gripping at me. Eventually, we reached home, and without a word, we both went to bed. couple of hours later, I awoke to the smell of sizzling eggs with ham and other vegetables added. I looked around and saw that my grandfather was still sleeping. I got up and checked outside in the kitchen area to see my grandmother laughing around the radio while cooking away. She looked completely healthy. I stared in confusion before she spoke. "Mijo, you're awake. Hurry, come and eat because your eggs are getting cold," she replied while putting some food onto her plate. "You're feeling better? Did you take your medication?" I asked in confusion. How was this possible? Yesterday, I thought she was dying, and now here she was like nothing had ever happened. "Oh, Mijo, it was a miracle. I prayed, and the Santa Maria delivered. I woke up completely fine and healthy. I feel like I could dance away my worries." She swayed her hips and patted my shoulder. I merely sat down and pondered as to what happened. What was that thing in the cave? Did it have something to do with my grandmother making a miraculous recovery? My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden hand on my shoulder. It was my grandfather making his way to take a seat on the kitchen table. "Morning, Mijo. Did you sleep alright?" He took a sip of the coffee before him, while subtly raising his eyebrow as if to make sure I followed his lead. I merely nodded and raised another eyebrow in confusion. I just wanted answers. My grandmother walked out to throw some seeds at the chickens. "Grandpa, what happened?" He rapidly shook his head as if to avoid someone catching us. "We don't talk about. Mijo, what happened last night is in the past. Now you forget about it and move on. I did what I had to do." His voice was soft, yet it carried such a heavy burden, like he was trying to reassure himself and me. I merely nodded and continued eating. The rest of the day carried on like normal. I went about feeding the animals random seeds here and there while listening to the radio. Its static kept interrupting the random news that popped up, keeping my only source of education very limited. For an 8-year-old, I was very curious about the world, almost too curious, according to my grandmother, who would try to answer my questions as best she could. But her little education would be covered up with words of wisdom that she obtained from the Bible that was once read to her when she was younger. My grandfather was set to go into the town that weekend, but decided to go in a couple of days earlier than usual. Like often, I was supposed to go along with him to help him bring back any supplies, but this time he decided to go by himself. As strange as it was, I didn't put up a fight because I wanted to play with a couple of the dogs that started showing up. When he arrived at night, he showed up in a brand new truck loaded with a bunch of supplies. My grandmother was just as surprised as I was, and she put her arms on my shoulders before badgering him with questions. "Antonio, where did this truck come from? How did you get all this?" "Mijo, help bring all the supplies in. There's also a bunch of toys back there. I have to talk to your grandmother." He waved me off while he started walking towards her, while holding a stack of papers. I ran over to the back of the truck and there was a shit ton of different fruits, vegetables, and all sorts of toys. Soccer balls, baseball bats, and even brand new shoes. I wanted to show my grandparents, but I stopped when I saw my grandmother tear up. "They really sent all this money? They're alive?" "Ay, mija, she's still alive. We need to give thanks to the Virgin Mary that they made it." I think they were talking about my parents. I wanted to ask, but something held me back. I could tell when my grandfather lied. He would look over the side and take a deep breath. He was doing the exact same thing here. That night we had a feast and I played with my brand new toys. That first batch of money was merely the start of a trickle, and pretty soon we had enough money to build an entire hacienda, which was a large plantation, common among the rich. My parents would only send some letters and a big check, but they never sent any pictures. They just told us about what they would do, how hot the weather was where they lived, and to take care of ourselves. Eventually, years went by, and they sent me off to boarding school so I could obtain the best education they could afford. It was a tough decision, but I maintained frequent contact with my grandparents. I never got to meet my actual parents because every time I would ask, they would never reply to our letters. My grandmother eventually got over the way they treated us because the money made up for it. That brings me to the present. I'm currently 21 years old and I'm finishing up my last year of university when I got a call that my grandfather was on his deathbed. It was his time to go. I hopped on the first flight to Mexico that I could find and made my way to Oaxaca. After a couple of days of traveling, I reached the driveway of my grandparents' hacienda. It was bigger and more beautiful than I remembered. Its glorious architecture was colored in a light shade of beige, and tall columns lined up the sides of the walls of the western and eastern wings. There was a large fountain in the middle of the front entrance that sparkled with lights of various colors of the ocean. It was anything anyone could dream of. Mijo, I'm so glad you're here. Your grandfather was asking about you a couple days earlier, but he's asleep now. He's not lucid, and the medications have him asleep. I think he's getting close. She wept as she brought me to his room, which was filled with various medical equipment, breaking away any silence with its beeping. I'll leave you two alone. I'll be right out if you need anything. I nodded, but gave her one big hug before she left. I stayed on the side of his bed just talking to him through the night, saying everything I wanted him to hear. I told him that I was so proud to have him as my father, the man who raised me and taught me to be as compassionate as he was. Eventually, it was getting late, and my grandmother ushered me to go to bed because we had to go into the town that morning to visit our priest in preparation for the services. It must have been around midnight when something woke me up. It was the sound of dogs crying out in the distance, whimpering and shrieking and making sounds I've never heard of before. But it wasn't those sounds that sent chills down my spine. It was the sound of horses click-clacking away, dragging chains around. The sound was right outside my bedroom door. I thought I was dreaming, but I tried turning on the lamp beside my bed, only for the light to surge and the bulb exploded, leaving shattered glass everywhere. I jumped out of bed and ran to my door, throwing it wide open, only to reveal that nothing was there. I ran to my grandfather's room, throwing that door open and rushing in, but nothing was there either. It was just the both of us in that room, with him still sleeping and the machines beeping along. It was so loud. I expected my grandmother to come barging in, but she didn't. But then I heard it again, the sound of the click-clacks of the hooves, and I looked out the window to see a hooded figure on a tall black horse with rusted metal chains on its legs. I couldn't make out a face, but the appearance made my heart race, and somehow I couldn't move. It was as if I was in a trance, just staring into the horse's red eyes, hoping that they wouldn't break through. Eventually, the figure grabbed one of the chains and threw it through the glass, shattering into a million little shards. The chain wrapped around my arm, and it tried pulling me out into the night. I tried fighting back with all my might and grabbed onto a nearby table and stuck my foot into the edge of a desk, preventing me from going further. It grabbed another chain and threw it at my grandfather's direction, wrapping around his left foot, and it quickly dragged him out of his bed, ripping away all the wires that was connected to him. I tried to scream, but I couldn't make a sound because I was running out of breath, trying to struggle against the chains, which were digging into my skin. It eventually dragged my grandfather out through the window, and just as I was losing all my force and falling forwards, I felt a sudden pressure on my arms. "Mijo, wake up. Your grandfather passed away last night." My grandmother shook me awake. I was drenched in complete sweat, but I still got up and ran to my grandfather's room. Seeing that the room was completely clean, the machines were quiet, and my grandfather laid motionless in the bed. He almost looked peaceful. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but as I moved closer, I saw bruises around his left foot, like something was wrapped around it. I looked down at my arm to see that it was completely purple, with specks of blood trickling out from the inflamed areas. I couldn't exactly tell my grandmother about everything that had happened, but I spent all day at church, begging for salvation. I tried to sleep it off and rationalize it, but as night grows closer, I can hear the soft neighs of the horse in the distance. I'm just so freaking scared. Do you think it's coming for me?